The first thing they noticed was not the silence. It was the sound. Not music, not laughter, not the clinking of crystal beneath a chandelier. It was the soft, dry whisper of hair falling. Strand by strand, it slipped from her head and drifted through the bright white light, landing on polished marble in front of executives, department heads, consultants, board members, assistants, spouses, and people who had spent years sitting across from her in conference rooms, pretending not to see what she carried. No one rushed forward. No one spoke her name. No one reached for her hand. The room did what rooms like that always do when cruelty arrives dressed as spectacle. It watched. Kofi stood near the center of it all, with a bourbon glass in his hand and a smile he thought he would remember for the rest of his life. His mother, Lorraine, raised her glass just slightly, in a gesture so smooth it could have passed for elegance if you did not know what sat beneath it. And the woman beside him, Tiffany, the one wearing a dark, fitted dress and a perfume she had no business wearing, pressed her lips together and failed to hide the laugh that escaped anyway. Under those lights, with every eye fixed on her, Renee lowered her gaze to the hair in her palm. Then she looked up. And she smiled. Not like a woman breaking, not like a woman begging her dignity to stay inside her long enough to make it to the exit. This was something else. This was the smile of a person who had already made peace with the truth, while everyone else in the room was still waiting for the performance to begin. It was calm. It was steady. It was almost gentle. And it carried something far more dangerous than anger. Certainty. The temperature of the room seemed to change at once. People felt it before they understood it. Kofi felt it too. His smile froze first, then it vanished. Because in that moment, with hair at her feet and humiliation carefully staged around her, Renee looked like the only person in the ballroom who knew exactly what was about to happen next. The night had started the way the most dangerous nights always start, beautifully. Meridian Tower rose high over the city, a sheet of glass and steel lit up against the Georgia skyline. On the 42nd floor, the grand ballroom had been dressed for Vantage Group's annual Elevation Gala, a white and gold celebration meant to honor growth, leadership, and the company's future. Everything in the room had been chosen to suggest power without ever having to say the word out loud. White orchids in tall arrangements, gold-rimmed glasses, candlelight reflected in marble and chrome, a jazz trio by the far wall, men in tailored suits speaking in careful voices, women wearing dresses that signaled taste, money, or the ability to get close to both. The kind of room where people believed hierarchy was permanent. The kind of room where people confused access with ownership. The kind of room where they thought they knew exactly who mattered. Renee arrived later than usual, and even that was intentional. She stepped out of the elevator in a deep navy dress she had bought weeks earlier, long before she understood how significant this night would become. It fit her perfectly, not because it was flashy, but because it didn't need to be. At 34, she had already learned something most people in that ballroom still hadn't. Real authority does not beg to be seen. It settles into a room and lets everyone else adjust. She moved past the registration table with quiet grace, accepted a nod from one of the event coordinators, and entered the ballroom as if she had every right to be there, which she did. Renee had worked at Vantage Group for 11 years. She had given that company more of herself than most of the people applauding its success had ever even considered offering. She had stayed late without announcing it, fixed broken systems without demanding applause, written strategy decks other people presented, solved departmental failures before they became board-level disasters. She had been overlooked, repackaged, underestimated, spoken over, borrowed from, and thanked in ways designed to sound generous while withholding the one thing that mattered most: recognition. And still she stayed composed. Still she learned. Still she took notes. At the base of her throat rested a small gold compass rose pendant. Most people never noticed it. Those who did assumed it was decorative. They were wrong. Her fingers had touched it once in the parking garage before she entered the building, the same way they always did when she needed to steady herself. The gesture was so automatic it almost belonged to the body instead of the mind. Her father had given it to her years earlier and told her something she never forgot. When people try to turn you around, don't panic. Find your true north. She saw Kofi before he saw her. He stood near the far side of the ballroom, with his shoulders loose and his chin slightly lifted, laughing too easily, the way men laugh when they think the night belongs to them. Tiffany stood close beside him, her hand lightly resting against her glass, her expression polished, pleased, a little too practiced to be innocent. Renee noticed the perfume first, not because it was common, but because it wasn't. It was hers. Her exact scent. The one that sat on her dresser at home. The one she had not finished, had not gifted, had not misplaced. The realization landed softly, without drama. That was the way truth often entered her life now. Not with noise, but with clarity. She filed it where she filed everything else. Quietly, precisely, without allowing it to alter her expression. If you're already feeling the tension in this story, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this are never just about revenge. They're about what people reveal when they think no one can stop them. Lorraine was nearby, dressed in cream, holding a champagne flute with the same smug composure she had worn for years. She had never insulted Renee in ways you could quote. That was not her style. Lorraine preferred the older, subtler methods. The delayed greeting, the excluded seat, the compliment that arrived with a cut hidden inside it, the family joke everyone was expected to laugh at, the coldness that could be denied the moment you named it. For years, Renee had struggled to describe what Lorraine made her feel. It had taken time to learn that some forms of hostility survive by staying deniable. But once you learn to name them, they lose some of their power. Renee moved deeper into the room, greeting colleagues, accepting sparkling water from a passing server, nodding at people from finance, operations, legal, communications. She was present, polished, calm. Nothing about her suggested fragility. Nothing about her signaled the storm already moving beneath the surface of her life. What Kofi had done that morning was still invisible. While she had been showering and getting ready for the gala, he had completed a plan he had been building with the confidence of a man who had convinced himself cruelty could still be called a joke if he smiled while doing it. He had replaced the shampoo bottle in their bathroom with something else. Hair removal cream. Concentrated. Strong enough to do damage quickly. He had carefully poured it into the familiar container, close enough in scent and texture that she would not suspect anything until it was too late. He had told himself it was temporary. He had told himself it was funny. He had told himself it would embarrass her, humble her, remind her not to carry herself the way she did lately. Men like Kofi often preferred language that made their ugliness sound manageable. A prank, a lesson, A harmless joke. Anything but the truth. The truth was simpler. He wanted to destroy her in public because he had become unable to tolerate her in private. He had laughed about it over texts with Tiffany, suggested it to Lorraine in careful fragments that allowed her to understand exactly what was coming without forcing him to say it plainly enough to hear himself clearly. And Lorraine, who had spent years helping her son avoid the weight of his own character, had done what she always did. She approved by refusing to object. When it began small. A strange heat at the scalp. A tingling that was not quite burning and not quite itching. Renee lifted her hand reflexively and touched her hair. When she pulled her fingers away, too much came with them. Something in the room shifted. Human attention is faster than language. People notice before they understand. A woman near the appetizers went quiet in the middle of a sentence. A regional director from finance looked down, then toward the ceiling, then anywhere but directly at Renee. Someone whispered. Someone else turned. The ripple spread outward in seconds. Then, hair began to fall. Not all at once. That would have been easier somehow. This was slower, more deliberate. Each second extending the spectacle. Each strand landing where people could see it. Each glance confirming to the crowd that this was really happening, and no one had moved to stop it. Kofi watched over the rim of his glass. Tiffany's mouth trembled with amusement. Lorraine raised her champagne. No one helped her. That was the detail Renee would remember later. Not because it hurt most, but because it clarified everything. Institutions train people to protect appearances first. The room was filled with polished professionals who knew the correct language for ethics, leadership, inclusion, and dignity. Yet when a woman stood in the center of them being publicly undone, they chose the oldest survival instinct in corporate America. Observe. Do not interfere. Wait to see which way power moves. Renee stood there in the full heat of their attention. She looked at the hair in her palm. She felt the exposure of her scalp beneath the chandelier light. She understood in one complete and bitter instant that this had been planned inside the home she shared with the man she had married. Then she smiled, and Kofi stopped smiling. To understand why, you have to understand Renee before the ballroom, before Vantage, before Kofi, before any of the polished damage that would come later. You have to go back to Atlanta. Back to a modest house on Briar Creek Road, where the kitchen light stayed on late, and the air always smelled faintly of coffee, laundry soap, and paper. Her father, Walter Caldwell, was not a loud man. He never confused volume with strength. He moved through life with the kind of patience that unsettled people who depended on noise to establish themselves. He worked, read, listened, and built. That last part mattered most, though Renee did not fully understand it when she was young. Walter believed some things were safer when grown in silence, not hidden out of shame, protected out of wisdom. He had learned early that visibility attracts interference, that if people see a foundation too soon, some of them will try to crack it simply because it exists. So he built quietly, signed nothing without reading it twice, entered no partnership he had not studied, spoke less than others expected, and understood more than they knew. Renee absorbed all of that without ever being formally taught it. Children learn from atmosphere before they learn from instruction. She learned that steadiness is a form of power, that discipline looks boring until it changes a life, that letting people underestimate you is sometimes more useful than correcting them. When she was 16, Walter placed a sealed envelope on the kitchen table between them. He told her that the envelope contained the truth about what he had been building for decades: legal structures, holdings, trusts, property, equity, a future. He told her she was named in all of it, that one day everything inside would belong to her. Then he told her not to open it. Not yet. He said she had to become herself first. He did not mean she needed to earn his love. That had never been in question. He meant that if she received the weight of inheritance before she knew who she was without it, she might spend the rest of her life confusing power with possession. He wanted something better for her than that. "How will I know when I'm ready?" she had asked. Walter took his time before answering. "You'll know," he said, "when you stop needing the world to confirm what you already are." That answer lived inside her for years. She carried it through college, where she was often the only black woman in advanced rooms where everyone spoke as if certainty belonged naturally to them. She carried it through her first job, where louder, less capable people repeated her ideas with more confidence and received the credit she had earned. She carried it into Vantage Group at 23, where she started at the bottom and climbed in a way that looked unremarkable to anyone not paying close attention. But real growth often looks ordinary from the outside. That was her gift. Not brilliance alone, though she had that. Not endurance alone, though she had plenty. It was the ability to keep building while others were busy performing themselves. She met Kofi at 26, at a birthday dinner for a mutual friend. He was charming in a way that felt unforced back then. Tall, warm, attentive. The kind of man who asked real questions and waited for real answers. He had ambition, humor, and a face that made trust come easily. Renee did not fall for him because he dazzled her. She chose him because she believed he saw her. That mattered. She had spent years being seen only in fragments by people who wanted what she could produce, but not who she actually was. With Kofi, at least at first, it felt different. He asked about her thoughts, not just her plans. He listened. He remembered details. He noticed when she was tired without making her explain it. He made her feel, for a while, that she did not always have to be the strongest person in the room. She loved him honestly. Walter met him, studied him, said little, and remained courteous. The compass pendant rested at her collarbone through all of it. Through dates, promotions, disappointments, the engagement, the wedding, the move into the house they shared. The morning she left for her first real job, Walter had fastened it around her neck himself. His hands had been steady. His expression had given away almost nothing. But his eyes had told her what his words didn't. Know who you are before anyone tells you otherwise. Walter died quietly on a Tuesday in November. No drama, no spectacle. Just a life that had been lived with intention, reaching its natural stillness. Renee sat with grief the way some people sit with weather, knowing it could not be rushed, only survived. For 3 days, she left the sealed envelope untouched. Then, one evening, alone at her kitchen table while a cup of tea went cold beside her, she opened it. And the world changed. She read every page twice, then a third time. Her father had built far more than she imagined. Holdings across industries, structures managed for years by a respected law firm in Midtown. Real estate, investments, equity positions. An empire though he never would have called it that. To Walter, empire was too loud a word for patient architecture. She cried that night not because of the money, though the scale of it was staggering, but because of the care hidden inside it. 40 years of invisible labor, 40 years of restraint, 40 years of building a future without ever burdening her with it too soon. Then, not long after the funeral, she found the receipt in Kofi's coat pocket. A dinner reservation at a restaurant that had once mattered to them both. Low lighting, live jazz, the place they had gone for an anniversary years earlier when everything still felt sincere. 2 guests, a night he had not mentioned. A coat she had picked up from the dry cleaner as one more automatic act of marriage. She placed the receipt on his nightstand, said nothing. The next morning she watched him find it. There are moments in a relationship when truth does not arrive as a discovery, but as confirmation. She saw it in the tiny calculation that crossed his face before he could hide it. Not guilt, not grief. Calculation. The look of a man deciding which version of the lie might survive. He said nothing. She said nothing. But silence can carry finality when words no longer matter. The affair was not, by itself, what ended the marriage. People betray each other in many ways and sometimes find their way back from it. What finished them was what the betrayal revealed beneath itself. Kofi had not wandered into someone else's arms out of confusion, loneliness, or pain he was too weak to name. He had built an alliance. Tiffany was not comfort. Tiffany was a weapon dressed as possibility. And Lorraine had been preparing the ground for years. Renee could see it clearly now. The careful comments in family settings. The implication that she was cold, too focused, too ambitious, hard to love, hard to please. The myth being built brick by brick until one day, if Kofi decided to do something shameful, there would already be a narrative waiting to excuse him. She called the law firm the morning after she found the receipt. Gerald Whitmore had worked with her father for years. He had been expecting this call eventually, though perhaps not under these circumstances. Renee drove to Midtown, entered a polished office with floor-to-ceiling windows, and sat across from him while he walked her through the full structure of her inheritance. When he finished, she asked one more question. "What about Vantage Group?" Gerald folded his hands and answered carefully. The company's current ownership structure made it vulnerable to acquisition under the right conditions. It could be done, quickly if necessary. How quickly? He studied her for a moment, not asking why. "Within weeks," he said. "Possibly sooner." She nodded once. "I want it completed before the gala." Gerald did not blink. "I'll begin immediately." If you've ever watched someone plan your downfall while having no idea you were already 10 moves ahead, drop a like and subscribe right here, because this is where quiet people become unforgettable. The weeks leading up to the gala became a strange kind of test. Renee lived inside 2 realities at once. In one, she was the same senior employee people had known for years, competent, composed, somewhat underestimated, often relied upon, not fully valued. In the other, invisible to everyone around her, she was becoming something else entirely. Owner. She said the word to no one. At home, Kofi continued deteriorating in ways he believed he concealed. Men who resent the women they once admired often become sloppy before they become cruel. The change had started months earlier. First, he stopped celebrating her wins. Then he stopped asking about her work altogether. Then, every success she had became, in his mind, evidence of what he lacked. A promotion she deserved felt to him like a judgment against him. Her discipline became arrogance in his telling. Her calm became accusation. Her competence became an insult he imagined she was directing at him simply by existing. Renee had made herself smaller for a while, hoping tenderness might do what logic could not. It never works, because when insecurity becomes identity, no amount of love can persuade it to behave honorably. She noticed small disturbances in the house. Bathroom items shifted, routine objects slightly out of place. Kofi taking an unusual interest in her morning schedule. Questions that seemed casual until you laid them side by side. She did not yet know the exact mechanism of his plan, but she felt the atmosphere of it. Something was being arranged, and still she waited. That was what people misunderstood about patience. They thought it meant passivity. It didn't. Patience was strategy stretched across time. Patience was knowing there is a moment when action becomes decisive rather than emotional. The acquisition closed the morning before the gala. By noon, she held the documents in her hand. Vantage Group, the same company where she had spent 11 years proving herself to rooms that kept moving the standard. The same company where people had borrowed her brilliance without learning her worth, belonged to her. Fully, legally, irreversibly. She drove home that evening and made dinner, the same way she had made dinner 100 other nights. Set the table, poured water, sat across from Kofi and watched him talk about nothing important. Watched him eat with the confidence of a man who believed tomorrow night would crown something inside him. He did not know that the ground beneath his life had already shifted. He did not know he was sitting across from the owner of the building where he planned to humiliate his wife. Under the table, Renee touched the compass pendant once. The direction was clear. Back in the ballroom, after her smile cut through the stillness, people waited for the collapse that never came. Kofi took one step forward, then stopped. He had planned for tears, outrage, a frantic rush to the restroom, maybe an early exit with people whispering afterward about how awful it had been. That was how humiliation was supposed to work. Break the target, satisfy the audience, reward the planner. But Renee stood there, spine straight, eyes clear, as if exposure itself had only simplified her. Then the ballroom lights dimmed slightly. A signal. The formal program was about to begin. At the front of the room, Bernard Cole, Vantage Group's outgoing CEO, made his way toward the podium. His presence had the old company effect. People straightened without meaning to. Conversations ended. Heads turned. Bernard was one of those men who understood how institutions communicate through posture before they communicate through language. He welcomed the guests, thanked them for attending, spoke briefly about the year's performance, the company's future, the importance of transition. Nothing unusual. Nothing that prepared the room for what came next. Then he paused. "I'd like to begin tonight," he said, "by introducing someone many of you already know." The room became attentive in a different way now. Curious. Uncertain. Someone who has been doing the work in this company for longer than many people here have realized. Someone whose title, as of yesterday morning, now reflects something much closer to the truth. And then he said her name. Renee walked toward the podium. Not quickly, not theatrically, just steadily. She moved through the room with her head uncovered, the remaining traces of what had been done to her visible beneath the chandelier light. And yet somehow those details no longer made her look diminished. They made everyone else look worse. The compass pendant caught the light as she passed. People stepped aside. She reached the podium, thanked Bernard, and stood still for half a second longer than most people would have dared. It was not hesitation. It was command. The room quieted until even the servers seemed to move more carefully. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm. "Good evening." Nothing about her tone reached for sympathy. That alone unsettled the room more than any tears could have. As of yesterday, Vantage Group is under new ownership. The legal transition is complete, and in the coming days the company will receive more information regarding leadership structure, strategic priorities, and operational review. A silence followed that felt alive. Some people blinked, as if the sentence had not arranged itself properly in their minds. New ownership, complete transition, leadership structure, operational review. Renee continued, thanking the employees who had done real work over the years. Not the performers, not the opportunists, the builders, the overlooked. The people whose names were often left out of rooms where decisions were discussed, as if labor materialized on its own. She said she had not forgotten them. Then she paused again. "And I also want to thank," she said softly, "those who underestimated me." Several faces changed at once. Not because I owe them anything, but because every dismissal, every slight, every effort to reduce me taught me something valuable. It taught me endurance, and endurance is what builds anything worth keeping. She looked out across the ballroom, found Kofi without searching. It was not anger in her eyes. That would have been easier for him. Anger still grants intimacy. This was clarity. The kind that arrives when someone who once had access to you no longer has any claim at all. She did not address him directly. She did not need to. Tiffany's expression began unraveling in real time. The confidence drained first, then the color. Lorraine lowered her champagne glass, and for the first time in years looked like a woman who did not know how to arrange her face. Bernard returned to the microphone after Renee stepped back. "One administrative note," he said. "As part of the ownership transition, all senior-level contracts at the vice president level and above will undergo review beginning next week. This is standard procedure." Kofi was among them. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. No one gasped out loud, though many wanted to. The devastation of the moment came from how civilized it remained. Consequence does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes like a tide, quiet, unstoppable, indifferent to your preference. Renee stepped down from the podium. A server handed her a glass of water. Bernard said something to her that made her laugh, an actual laugh, easy and unstrained. Then she moved back into the ballroom like a woman who owned every inch of marble beneath her feet. Because she did. Kofi did not approach her that night. He tried once, later, after people began reorganizing themselves socially around what had happened. But every instinct he possessed now was too late. He had spent months arranging humiliation and had walked straight into judgment instead. A few colleagues clapped him on the shoulder in passing without meeting his eyes. Others avoided him entirely. Some watched from a distance, already recalculating how close to him they had ever appeared. Renee left the gala when she chose to, not when the room forced her to. That mattered. When she stepped into the elevator, she was alone except for one elderly woman from legal who had worked at Vantage longer than almost anyone. The woman did not offer pity. She did not ask questions. She simply looked at Renee in the mirrored wall and said, Your father would be proud." Renee nearly cried then. Not in the ballroom, not under the lights, not in front of the architects of her humiliation, but in a descending elevator beside a woman who understood the cost of dignity. She went home that night and slept in the guest room for the last time. The divorce process began quietly. So did the reviews. Kofi's contract evaluation lasted 9 business days. The committee assigned to examine senior performance had access to everything the previous administration had left blurred or unexamined. Department metrics, turnover reports, internal complaints, budget inefficiencies, leadership feedback. 3 formal complaints that had been minimized before because the old structure had found him more useful than accountable. When the dust settled, the conclusions were not kind. His department had underperformed. Staff retention beneath him was poor. His reviews, once padded by relationships and perception, did not survive contact with actual scrutiny. By the end of the month, he was gone. There was a meeting, a separation document, the polite fiction of mutual professionalism, a handshake neither side respected. He left with a severance package that looked respectable on paper and felt humiliating in the hand. Then he went to Tiffany. He showed up at her apartment without warning, carrying the dazed exhaustion of a man whose imagined future had been set on fire and who still expected somebody else to provide shade. Tiffany let him in because she was not heartless, but she was attentive. And what she saw in him that evening was not a partner. It was liability. He talked about the review, the job, the company, the betrayal, as he framed it. He wanted comfort, reassurance, the continuation of the emotional refuge she had provided while he still seemed useful. Tiffany made him tea, told him it would be okay. But behind her eyes, she was doing arithmetic. Tiffany had never truly loved Kofi. She had been drawn to proximity, his role, his access, his confidence, the sense that being beside him might open doors. She liked the way his position reflected on her. She liked what he represented more than who he was. But now he represented collapse. And collapse is not attractive to practical people. Within weeks, she responded more slowly to his messages. Then hardly at all. Then one day, she sent a short text wishing him well, explaining she needed space, and exited his life with the efficiency of someone whose heart had never actually moved in. If you know what it's like when people disappear the moment your status does, subscribe now, because some of the hardest truths in life come from watching who stays when there is nothing left to gain. Lorraine tried at first to do what she had always done, rewrite reality. She called more often after the gala, not to ask how Kofi truly was, but to help build a story he could survive inside. Renee had been distant. Renee had been prideful. Renee had gone too far. Renee had hidden things. Renee had embarrassed him publicly. But the problem with narrative manipulation is that it weakens in the presence of witnesses. 300 people had been in that ballroom. They had seen the hair fall, seen Tiffany laugh, seen Lorraine raise her glass, seen Kofi smiling before the reveal and frozen after it. No elegant retelling could fully erase what a room had observed. And so the social circle shifted. Invitations stopped arriving. Not through scandal, through silence. The most devastating form of exclusion is often the one that comes without speech. Gatherings happened, and they were not included. Dinners were planned, and no one thought to mention them. People who had once leaned toward Lorraine in admiration now found themselves too busy to return calls. A few still offered surface-level politeness in public, but warmth had gone. People had reassessed. They did not like what they found. Tiffany left the city before summer. She resigned from the consulting firm that had tied her to Vantage's orbit and relocated somewhere she believed possibilities still lived. She did not use Kofi as a reference. She did not check on him afterward. She had always been better at leaving than staying. Kofi, meanwhile, discovered something he had not expected about disgrace. It is loud when it happens, and then unbearably quiet afterward. Interviewing for lower positions. Driving across the city in clothes that no longer fit his confidence. Watching former peers avoid eye contact in restaurants. Rehearsing explanations that sounded thin even to him. The thing that haunted him most was not the lost salary, not Tiffany, not even the divorce papers. It was the building. One ordinary afternoon, on the way to an interview 2 levels beneath the role he used to hold, he passed Meridian Tower and slowed at the light. The directory near the entrance had been updated. At the top, in clean black lettering, he saw her name. Renee Caldwell. He stared for 1 second too long, then drove on because there was nothing else to do. Renee did not spend much time thinking about him by then. That was perhaps the deepest cut of all. People imagined triumph as obsession fulfilled, revenge completed, justice performed with a steady eye on the fallen. But the truth is cleaner than that. Once consequence does its work, peace has no reason to keep visiting the ruins. She moved out of the house on Greenview and into a smaller place, by choice. She could have bought something sprawling, cold, architecturally impressive. She chose instead a home with good light, a quiet kitchen, and a back garden where early mornings felt like they belonged to the earth instead of the market. Her favorite time of day had always been before everyone else woke into their performance. Those first 40 minutes when the world had not yet begun asking for her. Coffee. Silence. The window over the sink. The slow gathering of light. One spring morning, after a long day of meetings and decisions, she found the compass pendant where she had left it on the kitchen table the night before. She picked it up and held it in her palm for a moment, feeling the familiar small weight of it. She thought of Walter, thought of the kitchen on Briar Creek Road, the rustle of a newspaper page turning, the stillness he carried like a second language. Not empty stillness, not cold stillness, a settled one. The peace of a man who had built his life without constantly needing someone to clap for it. Renee understood more of him now than she had when he was alive. She understood why he kept things quiet, why he waited, why the envelope had remained sealed for 18 years. He had not merely preserved wealth for her. He had preserved the possibility that she might meet herself honestly before power complicated the mirror. And she had. She had built a career the hard way, been overlooked, been used, been betrayed at work and at home. She had married with sincerity and left with clarity. She had stood in a room of 300 people while her husband's cruelty revealed itself in public, and still refused to give anyone the brokenness they had gathered to consume. That was the real win. Not the acquisition, not the title, not the way Kofi's face collapsed when the room turned against him. Those were consequences. The victory had happened earlier, in silence, when she chose not to become smaller in order to make insecure people more comfortable. Walter used to say, "Character is not what shines when life is easy. Character is what remains when things go wrong and you still refuse to become ugly in response." Renee thought about that often, especially when the world praised her outcome without understanding the womanhood inside it. Because the truth was, she knew many women who had endured humiliation, betrayal, sabotage, and dismissal without billions waiting on the other side. Women who had only their own labor, their own healing, their own discipline, their own refusal. Those women were the deeper story. Renee never forgot that. At Vantage, her leadership began with observation before action. She did not storm into the company trying to prove ownership through force. She reviewed structures, met with department leads, studied where inefficiency had been protected by ego, asked which employees had been carrying teams without recognition, looked carefully at who built and who merely occupied. People who mistook grace for softness learned quickly. She changed the culture without turning transformation into theater. Some executives were removed. Some were retrained. Some were given their first honest evaluation in years. Compensation structures shifted. Credit pathways became more transparent. Teams long ignored received budget and support. She created leadership forums where junior staff could present directly without having their ideas diluted by management layers desperate to own them. The company did not become perfect. No institution ever does. But it became harder for mediocrity to hide behind polish. One afternoon, months after the gala, a young black analyst named Mariah stopped Renee after a meeting. She looked nervous in the way ambitious young women often do when approaching power that resembles them for the first time. "I just wanted to say thank you," Mariah said. Renee asked, "For what?" Mariah hesitated, then answered honestly, "For being visible without acting like visibility is the whole point." Renee smiled. That sentence stayed with her all week. Because yes, visibility mattered. Representation mattered. But the deeper gift was not being seen. It was seeing what was possible without surrendering your center in order to achieve it. Months later, when the divorce was finalized, Renee did not celebrate publicly. She signed the papers, closed the folder, and drove home in traffic like any other person at the end of a long day. She cooked dinner for herself, opened a window, let the evening air move through the kitchen. There was no soundtrack, no champagne, no declaration. Freedom rarely sounds dramatic when it finally arrives. Sometimes it sounds like a quiet house that no longer feels hostile. Kofi called once after the papers were final. Not because he had changed enough to deserve the conversation, but because failure often makes people nostalgic for the doors they burned themselves. She let it go to voicemail. He left a message full of unfinished sentences and borrowed self-awareness. He said he had made mistakes, said he had not understood, said he wanted, if possible, to talk. She deleted the message, not out of rage, out of completion. There are some conversations you only think you need because you are still hoping the past might become intelligent. But the past rarely grows. It only waits to see if you'll revisit it from loneliness. Renee never called back. Lorraine sent a handwritten note once, 3 lines long, polished and poisonous in its restraint. It offered no apology, only a version of distance disguised as dignity. Renee read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer with other relics that no longer had the power to move her. On certain mornings, she would stand in her garden with coffee in hand and think about the ballroom. Not with pain exactly, but with a kind of astonishment. Human beings will often gather for another person's humiliation with more enthusiasm than they bring to someone else's healing. They love spectacle. They call it concern. They call it curiosity. They call it being there. But what they really want is permission to watch another person break without responsibility. She had denied them that permission. That mattered. Years later, people at Vantage still talked about the gala in lowered voices when they thought new employees could not hear. The official version remained professional, stripped of scandal, translated into the language institutions prefer. Ownership transition, leadership restructuring, contract review, strategic realignment. But offices have memory, and stories survive in the spaces between policy and rumor. They remembered the falling hair, the smiling woman, the man whose confidence vanished in real time, the mother lowering her glass, the other woman going pale, the podium, the announcement, the shift. Some called it the night Vantage changed hands. Others called it the night underestimation got expensive. Renee called it Friday. That was another thing people did not understand about her. They wanted her life to become myth because myth relieved them from having to imitate discipline. If her story was unbelievable enough, then they would never have to ask what small daily practices had built the woman who stood under those lights and refused to fold. But the answer was ordinary. Years of attention, years of restraint, years of seeing clearly, years of not announcing every wound, years of refusing to confuse softness with surrender. That is how people become formidable. Not all at once, not when the spotlight hits them. Long before. She kept the navy dress, not because it reminded her of victory, but because it reminded her of self-possession. She had it altered slightly and wore it once more to a private dinner years later where no one in the room knew its history. She liked that. Not every symbol needed to be public to stay meaningful. The compass pendant remained where it had always been, at her throat, small and gold, easy to miss if you were distracted by the wrong things. One fall evening, after a long board meeting, she visited her father's grave alone. She brought no flowers. Walter had never been a flowers man. She sat on the nearby bench and told him, quietly, about the company, the house, the changes, the peace, the small absurdities of leadership, the way she still sometimes reached for him in thought on difficult mornings. Then she laughed softly and said, "You were right. I knew when I was ready." The wind moved through the trees without answering, but she felt answered anyway. If this story has ever reminded you of a moment when someone tried to reduce you because they were terrified of what you already were, like the video, subscribe, and stay with this channel. Because the quietest people often carry the strongest endings. In the years that followed, Renee became known for many things inside Vantage. Precision, calm, unsentimental fairness, a habit of listening longer than people expected, and then asking the one question that dissolved everyone's performance. She was difficult to manipulate because she had already survived intimacy twisted into strategy. After that, corporate ego felt almost simple. She mentored selectively, not because she was ungenerous, but because she believed access should mean responsibility. She told young leaders the truth too many institutions hide. Most career damage does not come from one dramatic enemy. It comes from a long series of tolerated small diminishments. The idea borrowed without correction. The credit quietly moved. The disrespect laughed off. The boundary bent for harmony until you no longer recognize your own shape. Pay attention early, she told them. People rarely start by doing the worst thing. They start by seeing what you'll accept. That line circulated through the company. So did another one of hers. Never perform your power for people committed to misunderstanding it. People wrote it down. Good. They needed to. There were still days that felt heavy. Ownership did not erase human complexity. Success did not remove loneliness from the world. She still had moments when memory arrived unexpectedly. The smell of that perfume in a store. the sight of champagne in a woman's hand, the echo of laughter from another room. Healing is not amnesia. It is memory losing the right to command your body. And that, too, she learned. She learned that peace is not a reward for being untouched. It is a practice of returning to yourself after being touched by things that had no right to define you. She learned that forgiveness is sometimes irrelevant. Not because bitterness is holy, but because some people never grow enough to benefit from being released inside your heart. Sometimes indifference is the final clean room. She learned that power handled properly becomes quieter, not louder. And she learned, most of all, that the people who try hardest to humiliate you in public are often the same ones who have already been losing to you in private for a very long time. Kofi eventually disappeared into a smaller life. Not ruined in the dramatic sense, just reduced, which in some ways was more fitting. He found work again, though never at the level he once expected for himself. He aged faster after the gala, people said. Regret does that when it has nowhere noble to go. Once or twice he saw Renee's name in business articles and interviews. Once he turned off the television when her face appeared. Once he kept reading despite himself and hated that she looked exactly like herself. Calm, intelligent, composed, unbothered by the need to prove anything. Lorraine moved closer to a cousin in another city and built a new social life among people who knew only the edited version of her son's history. Some women survive by rehearsing innocence until it sounds like character. But even she, in unguarded moments, sometimes remembered that ballroom and the raised glass, and what it felt like to watch a woman not break. Tiffany married eventually. Someone in real estate, somebody stable and upward moving. She posted filtered photographs of vacations and soft furniture and the curated glow of a life built to look frictionless. Perhaps she was happy. Perhaps not. Renee never checked. One winter night, years after everything, Vantage hosted another Elevation Gala. The same ballroom, different flowers, new faces mixed with old ones. A younger executive asked Renee if returning to that room felt strange. Renee looked around for a moment. At the lights, the marble, the easy laughter, the servers moving through carefully arranged luxury. Then she said, "Rooms only keep power over you if you leave yourself behind in them." And that was that. She took the stage later that evening, not as revelation, not as surprise, not as a woman rising from someone else's cruelty, but simply as herself, fully inhabited, fully finished with the need for spectacle. Her speech that year was brief. It was about stewardship, responsibility, the obligation of leadership to protect dignity, not merely profit. She received a standing ovation she had not asked for. And when she stepped down, she did not think about the old night at all. Because she was home, inside herself now. That is the part most people miss when they tell stories like this. They want the humiliation, the reversal, the public justice, the visible fall. They want the ballroom and the announcement and the faces changing color beneath expensive light. They want the moment evil gets embarrassed. And yes, those moments satisfy something real in us. We are human. We recognize balance when it finally arrives. But the deeper story is quieter. A daughter keeping a promise. A woman learning to name what hurts her. A mind that refuses to be rushed into reaction. A heart that breaks and still does not surrender its standards. A life built in such a way that when cruelty finally steps forward and reveals itself, it finds not a victim waiting to collapse, but a whole person already standing there. That was why Kofi stopped smiling. Not because he lost his job. Not because the room turned. Not because Tiffany stepped away or his mother's influence failed to protect him. He stopped smiling because, for one terrifying second, he saw the truth in full. He had mistaken patience for weakness. He had mistaken grace for passivity. He had mistaken access for ownership. And worst of all, he had mistaken a woman's silence for ignorance, when all along she had simply been choosing the exact moment the world would finally see what he was. Some people will spend their whole lives trying to make you feel small, because they cannot survive standing next to your full size. They will insult you, then smile. Betray you, then explain. Humiliate you, then call it misunderstanding. They will gather witnesses and wait for you to come apart, so they can feel powerful for a few cheap seconds. Let them wait. Let them build the stage. Let them take their seats. And when the moment comes, give them nothing that belongs to your peace. Stand there. Know who you are. Smile if you want to. Then let consequence do the rest.